Hey guys, I wanted to talk about hunter builds today and what I think the powerful ones are for the overall game. Currently, I do think hunters might be the strongest class in the game, mainly because of their damage output. However, warlocks still do have some merit. But I did already make a warlock build video, so if you are interested in seeing the prismatic build that I have for warlock, you can check that out. I'll have it linked in the description. But yeah, this one's mainly going to cover two main builds on Hunter. Basically, we're going to have a tether one for like general roam content, like GMs and stuff, and then we'll have another one that's for like DPS stuff, like doing raid damage. There's not much else to it, so let's go ahead and get into it. So I know I said that there were two varieties of the build, but there's really more like two and a half. I technically have a third, and basically this is just one that doesn't require an exotic class item. Basically, one build is going to use the exotic class item and the other is not, so if you don't have access to the exotic class item, you can make use of this still. And basically, we'll start off with no exotic class item, and this is just going to be Orpheus Rig Tether, but on Prismatic Hunter instead of Void Hunter because Prismatic is objectively stronger. So obviously, you'll start off using Tether and Orpheus Rigs as your exotic for the super. However, if you do have access to good exotic class items, then instead I would recommend running Silence and Squall, or just still using Tether without Orpheus Rigs, it's still pretty good. And then you would want to have a Synthoceps exotic class item with maybe Calibans or something else, whatever you would really like. Calibans basically adds more ag clear to your melees, but it does do annoying stuff like automatically blow up tangles that you might have wanted for movement, or steal kills from combination blow if you're trying to use combination blow. I will let you guys know though that this build actually doesn't use combination blow. I'm not really a huge fan of it on Hunter. It's definitely not bad, but I think it's pretty overrated, and I think that the melees that we have access to on Hunter are actually insanely strong, and I'd rather use those instead. So we'll talk more about that when we get to that segment, but just thought I'd let you guys know that. So that's pretty much your choices for the exotic and super pairing. And now we're going to move on to the rest of the build, and this is pretty much shared between either choice that you make for the exotic and super pairing. So basically I'll just have a build link to both of these, and they're going to be pretty similar other than the super and the exotic. So next up, we'll start off with the grenade. The grenade, you've got two main options on Hunter, and it's pretty much either of the darkness ones. You can use the Duskfield grenade for harder content or the grapple for easy content. That's what I like to do. The grapple has great movement and also adds damage in the form of melees. It's very, very powerful with the Synthoceps setup, whereas if you're not using the Synthoceps, you might want to use Duskfield instead, unless you still want the grapple for movement. But Synthoceps grapple melees still do absolutely absurd damage, and it's by far the highest form of melee damage in the game. And next up we have the melee, and there are again a couple of really good options. You could use the combination blow, but like I said earlier, I'm not a huge fan of that, so we're not going to be doing that. My preferred melee is really the threaded spike. I think this thing is insanely underrated, and it's super powerful with Synthoceps Caliban as well. Whenever you have Synthoceps active, it does some absurd number like 80,000 damage to ads, which is more than enough to clear even the most, potent ads in the game in one shot. On top of this, having Calibans also makes all those enemies it kills explode, which just adds even more splash to it, and it really does just turn into a room clearer in a single button. And remember that it pings multiple targets, and then you can catch it out of the air, and if you do that, you get energy back, and it might make you not need your dodge to get the ability back. That being said, it does require you to use Gambler's Dodge, and it's not an automatically infinite loop. You do have to wait for your dodge to come back, so you either have to make good use of the melee by hitting lots of targets at once, or make use of your weapons during the downtime. It's kind of up to you what you want to do. Another good option is the Shurikens. However, I would only use these if you do use the Synthoceps class item, because otherwise they just don't do enough damage to really one-shot anything, and they're not very good. But when you do have the Synthoceps active, they actually do one-shot enemies, they bounce pretty good, and you get 2 charges. And there's also the Smoke Bomb, which is a nice utility thing. It doesn't really do good damage, so if you're not using Synthoceps, the Smoke Bomb is pretty okay as well. It does apply Weaken, which is pretty good, but this is really more of a DPS specialized thing, which is not really what this build is about. And for the dodge, make sure you're using Gambler's Dodge. This build is pretty heavily melee focused no matter what, so highly recommend Gambler's Dodge, not really any other competition. And moving on to aspects, you've got pretty much 3 choices here that I would pick between. The first one is Stylish Executioner. Always have this. This is pretty much just broken. It's actually so powerful. Literally any debuffed enemy gets killed and you go invisible and you get wall hacks. It's absolutely ridiculously powerful for survivability, and it is super good. And you're proccing all the time with something like the Threaded Needle, where it's severing enemies and killing them, which does give you the invis effect. As for the other one, I would recommend going with either Gunpowder Gamble or just using Winter's Shroud. It's kind of up to you. I think Gunpowder Gamble is honestly better for this setup because you don't really need the Winter's Shroud to prime enemies with a debuff before you kill them, because again, this isn't a punch build. You know, we're not just doing one of those dodge and punch hunter builds that is every single hunter build. And lastly, we have the fragments, and there's pretty much going to be 4 main fragments I highly recommend having, and then a flex slot in the end, so we'll talk about that. The first one is Facet of Protection. This is by far the most powerful survivability fragment on the subclass as a whole, just because some supers don't offer very good survivability verbs for Facet of Purpose. Facet of Protection always works, it's just free damage resistance, super good. The next one is Facet of Blessing. Because this is a melee build, you are getting health back from this. However, it is important to note that this is not the most powerful healing effect in the game, and that it's not going to absolutely carry you from a healing perspective. So just kind of bear that in mind with how aggressive you're playing with the build. This could probably be replaced, especially if you're using a super that gives you a good healing verb, but if you're on Tether, you're only getting Overshield from Facet of Purpose, so I wouldn't recommend it. Next up is Facet of Dawn. This is super good, not only for getting the weapon damage buff whenever you melee targets, which you're doing all the time, but also because having Radiant procs the next fragment we're going to talk about. And that is Facet of Hope. You pretty much always have light buffs or dark buffs whenever you're doing literally anything with anything prismatic, so this is pretty much just always active, and it is free class ability regen, which is super good, because again, you can get your melee back off of your dodge, which is super helpful for being able to spam your dodge, and I find that this just helps you sort of maintain the uptime of something like Threaded Spike, which doesn't have an infinite ability loop. And for the flex slot, I go ahead and just use Facet of Purpose for Void Overshield anyway. Void Overshield's not that strong if you're using Tether, but it is super good if you're using either Solar or Stasis, so I still recommend using it anyway, but this can sort of be swapped out for something else you might be looking for in your build, especially if you're using Void, just because you already kind of have healing from Facet of Blessing, and you are going invisible with most of your kills anyway. As always, I kind of like to leave these builds up to interpretation for you guys, and so you can sort of pick and choose how you want it to be, but I'll definitely give you the base template that I personally use for the most part. So now we're going to move on into the damage build. This one's probably going to go a lot quicker because I know this one has been covered more often. However, it is also very rigid and pretty specific in how it works. So let's go ahead and get into that. First of all, you're going to be using Celestial Nighthawk and Golden Gun. That's just a given. There's not really any other choices when it comes to damage right now. It's super powerful, and you're also going to want to use Still Hunt because that's still broken. As for your grenade, you're basically going to want to be using Dusk Fields. This is pretty much the only way to apply a debuff to an enemy at long range. You could use the Threaded Spike as well, which also severs, which I think is good for solo content, but if you're on a full team that's keeping you alive with something like a well, then you're going to be better off using the Snare Bomb. But if you are using the Threaded Spike, you could use Grapple instead if you wanted to, then you wouldn't need the Dusk Field. And so that kind of covers the grenade and the melee. Pretty much the optimal pairing if you're being kept alive by other means is going to be Snare Bomb and Dusk Field. As for the aspects, they are pretty much meaningless to the DPS of this build, so you can kind of do whatever you want, but I still recommend using Stylish Executioner as it is super powerful. And the other one really doesn't matter because it just doesn't, there's not really much that gives a lot of value to your DPS. So you could just use something, again, for your neutral game, sort of like Stylish Executioner. You could just go with Winter's Shroud if you wanted to do some freezing or some slowing. Or you could just go with the classic Gunpowder Gamble, which is pretty good too. Just add a little bit of ag clear. You could also throw it at the boss at the start of damage if you wanted to. It's kind of whatever, it's not really a big deal. And lastly, for the fragments, there are 2 main fragments that are really good, and the rest are kind of just for your neutral game. Once again, we use Facet of Protection. This is just a neutral thing. Then we have Facet of Courage. This is the one that increases the damage that you deal to targets using light abilities whenever they are debuffed by a dark ability. So this is why you're using the Dusk Field, is so that you can apply slow while you're shooting your Golden Gun. That way you get the increased ability damage. Next up is Facet of Dawn. Getting Radiant is super important for Golden Gun, and it also obviously increases your gun damage, which is super good as well. The next one is Facet of Hope. This is nice because your dodge does affect your DPS. You could pretty much use either the reload dodge with marksmans, or you could use the Radiant dodge if you want to have better Radiant uptime and apply it to your teammates. The choice here really does just depend on the damage rotation that you're doing and whether or not you need reload assistance via the dodge. And lastly, Facet of Purpose for your neutral game and staying alive, because you will be getting Restoration, which is a pretty good verb because you're using Golden Gun. And that's pretty much it for that build, and that's going to wrap up the video. If you guys did make it to the end, thank you so much for watching. It is much appreciated. And remember, I do have a Discord that I have all my friends in. We have over 200 members now, and I'm always trying to get more. So if you do want to join, I've got a link in the description below. We do have a lot of cool stuff in there, including a channel with a bunch of build links that you can use to just find good builds for yourself. But yep, that's the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.